Normally I would be doing a music production video, a video that would be breaking down a project that either I made or a project that I've been interested in, whether that's a project from a big artist or a smaller artist. But we're not doing that today. We're going to be taking a look at the George Floyd protests, and specifically the cops and the way that the cops have been behaving as of recent. The way that the cops have been behaving have been really interesting to me, as it tells me what their interests are. And this is not speaking for all police departments, just a vast majority of them. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's been happening. And before we look at the George Floyd protests, we're going to take a look at the lockdown protests that have happened in various states across the country. I think we're going to be taking a look at two specific instances, one in Michigan and one in California. So let's take a look at this. So you can see that the protesters are yelling, but again, not particularly interested in the protesters here. I'm interested in the way that the cops are. The cops here are dressed in their typical uniform with the mask on, obviously because of COVID. So just take a note of that. We'll come back to that later. Okay, and then we'll take a look at the one that happened in California as well. So you get the point. These police officers, again, are dressed in their typical uniform, this time without masks. There's a question that popped up because now this has their message that they're sending across. I'm not going to be focusing on what would have been if the protesters were people of color. There's a lot of discussion about that already. I'm still just focused on the cops. So we see all of that going on. Now, I wanted to go also to a Twitter thread that would show a good number of footage or a good number of clips showing what's been happening during the George Floyd protests. Now, I couldn't find a Twitter thread for the lockdown protests. If I was able to, I would have been showing it here. But before we move on, just so you know, the account that I'm getting this from is Greg Duchette. Greg Duchette in particular has the Never Trump conservative descriptor in his bio. So you know where he's coming from. Conservative, but not in favor of Trump. I just want to preface this by saying, just describing what's been going on with the protests. The protests have reached a massive scale. We've seen protests happen across all 50 states, 3 U.S. territories, and we've seen it happen in 6 different continents. Obviously, we have the Americas, North America, South America. We have Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Oceania, which is Australia and New Zealand. So this has reached a massive scale, and a lot of people are aware of what's happening. So just want to show what kind of demonstrations have been made here, specifically in the U.S., and how the police have been responding or behaving in this nature. Okay? Unprovoked, the police officers go with pepper spray. They're dressed in a little bit more of a protective gear set. Let's take a look at what's happening here. Cop cars right here. You see the overhead view. They are dividing the cop cars with a barricade. They're separating themselves with a barricade, and watch what happens right here. I'm sure a lot of you who have been on Twitter have already seen this footage. Let's continue and see what's happening. There's one that's been really interesting to me, and I think this one is actually rather telling. It's the way that they handle media figures or people who are reporting on for media outlets. Take a look at that. Now, obviously, even if they arrest the media, or if they arrest someone who's reporting for media, they're gonna have to release them because there's no actual valid reason for arrest that they can press further charges on them. Um, Here we have the 10-year-old who was pepper sprayed. I've only seen photos of it. I've not seen footage of it, so that's interesting. You have I can't really tell if that's the caption says that the police are caught on camera for pushing a reporter into open fire. Whether or not that's true, they're pushing someone into open fire, and that's a problem. Let's see what the hell's going on with this. Protesters are sitting on the ground. They're sitting on the ground. They are unarmed, not provoking anybody. And they're pepper spraying. And also the way that they're dressed too is a little bit more than just their typical uniform. Oh, I really hate seeing that. But they are dressed in they are significantly more protected in these scenarios, in these cases. So they come out a little bit more dressed than the protests for the lockdowns that we've taken a look at. So let's discuss. There are two angles that I want to take at for this one. Number one is that the angle that I'm interested in, that I think really tells what's been going on, is that the two different protests, the lockdown protests and the protests for George Floyd, both have a fundamental difference in how they challenge power. The lockdown protests actually don't challenge power at all. The lockdown protests are right in line with what Donald Trump wanted, what the White House wanted, which is to reopen the economy. And by state, unfortunately for them, they had to lock down the economy to slow the spread of COVID-19. But that was right in line with what Donald Trump wanted, which is why they were treated quite differently when they were pushing back against the police officers. Obviously, the police officers didn't really do much. They had they were just kind of telling them, calm down. And also, the way that they were dressed is a typical uniform with the mask on. Now, there were some instances. I should have pulled up footage for this, but there were some instances in which officers were dressed up in riot gear. And some of the protesters were unarmed. This was specifically, I believe, in California, where that might have happened. But a majority of the instances that we see with these lockdown protests are with not very armed police officers. The police officers weren't armed. So by the numbers, that's what we're looking at there. Whereas with the George Floyd protests, a vast majority of them are peaceful protesters. And we see these police officers dressed up in riot gear. And why is that? Because when you have a situation like George Floyd bringing out the light in sort of the police brutality that's been going on, that fundamentally threatens the power structure, that fundamentally threatens the institution of law enforcement. And they are fighting. They are fighting and making things violent. They are inciting violence specifically to maintain their institution of power. This is my take on it. And that institution of power is supported by racial injustice within the system. A vast majority, not a vast majority, but a large percentage of black folk who get murdered are murdered wrongfully, or do not justify murder. And clearly George Floyd was like the most recent, was one of the most recent cases for that. I'm sure that it's been happening elsewhere and we just haven't gotten media coverage of it because the protests have been taking the spotlight. So that's one angle at it. It's a threatening, basically the two different protests highlight a difference in the ways that the messages threaten the institution of law enforcement. So what's the other take? The other take is that my friend had told me that the reason that these protests have largely been, police officers have largely been inciting violence, and the way that they've been dressed in riot gear is because actually these protesters aren't armed. If you saw the state capitol, the protests that happened in the state capital of Michigan, as one as well, the one in California, there were actually a considerable number of armed protesters that showed up to that event, and the police officers came in a uniform that didn't seem to indicate any intention of escalation. So the point that he's making is that if protesters were to come armed, police officers would be less likely to come and threaten the protesters. And a lot of that has to deal with the fact that they got to save their lives first. They can't be going out there really taking a bullet from a protester. And also, armed protesters understand that if they were to open fire and shoot, as long as the system maintained power, that they would be easily jailed and easily press charges against. So those are the two different perspectives. I definitely think that it's more of an indication of what the power structure here is, and how that's being threatened with the George Floyd protests. The message is getting louder every day. We've been at this for 1 week and 3 days at this point. So we're seeing all of this unfold, and I am willing to bet that at this point, more people have turned out to protest in the name of George Floyd than the protests that have happened after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. That had happened across 110 different cities over the course of 6 days for Martin Luther King. I think we've had more than that for George Floyd at this point. So this is not slowing down anytime soon. What kind of change we might get from it, I am not entirely sure. I'm not sure to be optimistic just yet. But we keep fighting. I'm definitely someone on the side of the protesters. I understand that rioting and looting is also not entirely good. But the voice that needs to be heard right now are the people who are fighting for racial injustice, or fighting against racial injustice. So with that being said, please, if you go out and protest, if you decide to do so, keep yourself protected. Please wear eye gear. Please, there are a list of steps. I'll be putting resources in the link below this YouTube description for anybody who might need to take a look at some of these things. Please keep yourself safe. The last thing you want is to go attend a protest and to end up severely injured or even killed. And also the COVID breakout is still a concern. If you are interested in going to a protest, I highly recommend that you please seriously take into consideration the people that you are living with. If your living situation includes a number of old folk, that maybe it's not the best thing, or it's not in your best interest to go and attend a protest. If you are interested in helping out in other ways, that's also very cool. I understand that not going to a protest is very, very unsexy, but you can still encourage other people to go in place of you, and in other ways help out. So anyway, that's my take on George Floyd. Recap: cops are fighting to make sure that their place in power maintains and stays the same. And my friend also believes that armed protesters would help the situation. With that, please stay safe. I appreciate you for watching this, and I love all of you. Take care.